Welcome into Eastern Panhandle Talk. Our guest in the 9 o'clock segment is Scot Faulkner, the author of the critically acclaimed bestseller Naked Emperors, The Failure of the Republican Revolution, ? He advises numerous corporations on strategic change and leadership. He's appeared on Bloomberg, CBS News, CNN, C-SPAN, Fox, NPR, PBS, Voice of America. Scot Faulkner, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
First off, let me tell you also that Scot Faulkner was involved in the Reagan Bush administration. He was head of personnel during the campaign, part of the transition team as well. And I could just stop right there, as in you knew Ronald Reagan, and I would just stop right there. Reagan converted me to Republicanism. My first Democratic voter card, my first voter card read Democratic Party when I was 18. Ronald Reagan came into office when I was 17 years old and switched me over, so to speak, and I never went back. Tell me about Ronald Reagan a little bit and your...
Well, he certainly was one of the most influential people in my life. I was very lucky to meet him for the first time in September of 1975. He was coming out to Minnesota for a fundraiser, and I was assigned, as I was part of the staff of the Minnesota Republican Party at the time, to kind of squire him around in preparation for the fundraiser. And so we literally had several hours just one-on-one, and it was just an epiphany moment for me. And then from there, I was part of his 76 campaign, again in Minnesota. And when he came out to that convention, he did a lot of one-on-ones with back then there was still uncommitted delegates, and the delegate count for 76 was very critical. And so again, I got to spend about a half day just one-on-one with him, working with different groups, and got to see him, again, his own intellectual brilliance, which was talking to individual delegates, talking to groups of delegates, fielding all sorts of questions. And so when people question his intelligence or his agile mind, he was sharp as could be. He was a true thought leader for the conservative movement. And then Detroit in 1980, I was brought out to work with him and serve as a liaison to congressional delegations attending Detroit. And it was then that I was tapped to be the director of personnel. And so that time I had a lot of friends in the conservative movement, and so this was Lee Atwater and Frank Donatelli and some others from that era. They came up to me and said, "Can you hire 900 people in 60 days?" And I was known as Mr. Jobs in my role up on Capitol Hill. I was chief legislative assistant to John Ashbrook, who at that time was heading the National Rifle Association on the board of the American Conservative Union, and I was basically placing young conservatives all over Washington. So I said, sure, and 60 days later we had 900 people on board, which was literally 600 at the headquarters, the others spread around through state organizations, and then about 30 people each on the two planes, one for Bush, one for Reagan. And in September, actually right around Labor Day of 1980, the Timmons and some of the internal pollers showed that Carter was already a dead man. I mean, I called him the falling man, because it was like a Polaroid picture of someone falling off the Empire State Building. He was dropping in the polls every day, and so they said, let's start planning the transition. And so working with the transition team very secretly to develop the transition, and it ended up being one of the most efficient transitions probably of the 20th century, certainly. And one of the reasons is that we worked very closely with the Secret Service and the FBI, and we pre-cleared a lot of people. So literally within a week of the election, we had access to sensitive material, which at that time was very important, because you had everything from the Iranian hostage crisis to the Soviet Union on the march in Afghanistan and the Caribbean, and as well as Central America. And so being able to have literally hundreds and hundreds of potential appointees for the incoming administration already pre-cleared, it really sped our process. So we were able to hit the ground running. January 21st, I was actually the sixth person into the White House that morning after the inaugural. And only time I got to actually drive onto the roadway between the executive office building and the West Wing, because I was later assigned just a parking place in the ramp across the Pennsylvania Avenue. But it was kind of fun to take my little Mustang, which I'd used in all my years of field work for the Republican Party, and with my Reagan stickers on the back, and drive into that.
What year Mustang was it?
That was 1970 Mustang Grandie,
Nice.
gold.
Gold, sweet. Yeah.
Landau roof.
Uh-huh. Got to have the Landau roof, baby. I don't mean to make this about Ronald Reagan, but I don't get to meet people who knew Ronald Reagan personally every day. So before we move on to the real reason why we have you here, did Reagan ever really, truly, personally realize the effect he had on people and the American people in the country?
Yes. Well, I had my last time speaking with him, my wife and I were out in California. I was keynoting a conference, and Nancy, who I'd stayed in touch with, said, well, if you're out here, maybe we can get you in to see Ronnie. This is March of '96. This is after Ronnie had basically stepped back from public life because of his Alzheimer's, and we were on standby for about an hour or two to see if he was having a good day. And thankfully he did. So my wife and I had 45 minutes alone with him. And we talked about the old days, about the revolution, about not only the impact he had on America, but really on the world. The whole issue of that when you look at, to me, the best troika of the 20th century, which was Margaret Thatcher, John Paul II, and Reagan, and how the three of them systematically brought down the Soviet Empire. In fact, back in March of 2008, Bill Wilson, who was the head of the kitchen cabinet, was a good friend of mine. He comes into my office in the old executive office building and says, I'm going to leave the kitchen cabinet and go and be ambassador to Rome. And I'm sitting there at that time. It was sort of a toss-away position. And I said, well, why are you doing that? And he said, because Reagan needs me there, and you'll see why. And years later, I worked a bit and advised Solidarity and Chirac in his first mayor's race in Paris. And so when we started to really see the power of the papacy at that time as a secular force, as well as a spiritual force in peeling away Eastern Europe from the Soviet Empire, and then the way Thatcher worked from her directions, I mean, it was an amazing relationship between those three. And so Reagan and I spoke about that, and about that really that changed everything in the world. And we're still benefiting from many aspects of not having a Soviet empire.
I've always contended that the two bravest acts of the second half of the 20th century, number one was when that guy stood in front of that tank in Tiananmen Square and the tank moved, he moved. And the second bravest act of the 20th century was when Reagan walked away from Gorbachev at Reykjavik.
Yes.
When he said no, because I think any other American politician would have caved in to Gorbachev, and things probably would still be going along as they are now. But that right there was the real, that if there was a momentary that was it.
Well, I think the key is that, and we're seeing that unfortunately with the 2012 cycle coming around, you have nobody who is thinking in big ways.
Yep.
You have no one who is truly thinking about an ideological outcome first and themselves second. And Reagan was probably the last of our leaders, certainly our last of our presidents, who came into office not as a cult of personality, but as the leader of a true ideology. And the bringing down the Soviet Empire was one of the touchstones of that.
If you'll remember back before Reagan announced, there was a poll that one of the radio stations in the district conducted, and they said, out of all of the available candidates, and there was some question as to whether Nixon qualified.
Tanned, rested, and ready.
But no, this was after he was impeached and all. They had this poll, and Nixon won. So they did not release the poll. So they went back and they grabbed another 100 people out of the phone book, and they said, out of all of the presidents we've had since the turn of the 20th century, who would you like to see back? And Nixon won again. So they never released the poll. Months later, the Washington Post got a hold of it and brought that out. But which goes to show that at that time, and except for Reagan, there weren't any real big thinkers. I like John Connally. I was always one of his favorites. And I ran into him at the airport, and he said, I always knew that Reagan could have it if he wanted it, but he was late, because it was January, I guess, of the year that before he ever really declared.
Well, Reagan had a big announcement event in November '79 up in New York, which Bill Casey chaired, and that was part of the relationship that built there. And again, Casey was a The definitive book on Casey's never been written, and he did so much to help us win World War II, in charge of OSS operations in the Mediterranean, and then he was a pivotal figure in taking down the Soviet Empire.
Scot Faulkner is our guest here on Eastern Panhandle Talk. Jerry, did you want to finish a point?
No, I would just say, if you looked at Soviet, if you looked at Russia and the other countries in Eastern Europe, they had to go through a period of benevolent despot after they got rid of the czars, because they really weren't politically sophisticated enough to make that transition from monarchy to any kind of parliamentary or democratic society.
There were fledgling ones like in the Balkans and all, but they were extinguished within 10 years
because of Stalin World War II.
The book is called Naked Emperor. Scot Faulkner is the author. Look for it on Amazon.